Sera Kim moved through the gleaming or prep room with quiet efficiency, her hands assembling a tray of instruments a fraction faster, a hair more deliberately than the hospital's rigid protocol dictated. "Nurse Kim," Dr. Dubois drawled, a smirk mirroring Dr. Morales' absent scowl, "we follow the textbook here, not your creative interpretations." Morales himself merely offered a dismissive flick of the wrist, a common gesture toward the untrained rookie. The rebuke still hung in the air when the emergency room doors burst open, heralded by a frantic siren shriek. Paramedics thundered in, pushing a gurney. On it lay Javier Ramos, a boy barely 20, his youthful face ashen, eyes wide with terror, a horrific crimson stain blooming across his chest. Massive internal bleeding, a medic gasped, voice strained. The frantic beeping of monitors filled the suddenly hushed or, a terrifying rhythm of a life rapidly slipping away. Sera's eyes, despite the sting of the dismissal, fixed on Javier's pale, young face. A dormant fire ignited within her, a silent, grim resolve that tightened her jaw. This wasn't just another patient, this was a fight she knew how to win. The pristine gleam of Olympus Memorial's operating theater, usually a testament to its cutting-edge precision, now reflected a horrifying tableau of escalating crisis. Javier Ramos, just a boy, lay pale and still on the surgical table, the rhythmic beep of the cardiac monitor struggling against the frantic whispers and clatter of instruments. Dr. Morales, a figure of imposing authority even in surgical scrubs, dominated the space. His voice, usually a measured baritone, began to take on a sharper edge as his precise, textbook maneuvers failed to stem the tide of blood. "Suction! More suction!" Morales barked, his brow furrowed in a way Sera had never seen before, a hairline crack in his impenetrable facade of control. He worked with a surgeon's familiar grace, his hands moving with practiced speed, but the results were clear. Javier's blood pressure continued its alarming descent, his heart rate spiking erratically. The monitors, usually reassuring in their constant display of life, now screamed a desperate warning. Dr. Dubois, ever at Morales' side, echoed the chief's commands with unhelpful enthusiasm, occasionally casting a dismissive glance at Sera. She stood a little apart, a quiet shadow in the controlled chaos, her assigned task of monitoring vitals almost secondary to the intense, almost predatory focus in her eyes. It was a familiar focus, honed not in gleaming ORs but in dust-choked tents and makeshift clinics where precision was a luxury and survival was the only metric. Sera watched Morales' frustration mount. He was brilliant, she knew, but his brilliance was rooted in perfect conditions, in predictable anatomy. This wasn't textbook. The internal bleeding was unlike anything she'd seen in her brief time at Olympus, but chillingly familiar from a past life she desperately tried to bury. She saw the specific pattern of egress, the telltale discoloration, the subtle, almost imperceptible pulsation Morales seemed to be missing. It was a rare, insidious tear in a vessel that, if accessed conventionally, would only worsen the situation. It needed a different approach. A dirty approach. Her heart began to pound, a frantic drumbeat against the sterile silence of the OR. Javier's vitals plummeted further, a terrifying freefall. The surgical team, moments ago efficient and composed, now shifted restlessly, their faces etched with a growing, unspoken fear. They looked to Morales, but even his usually unwavering gaze held a flicker of uncertainty. Dr. Morales, Sera's voice, a quiet murmur, sliced through the tension. It was barely a whisper, yet in the suddenly quieter room, it felt like a clap of thunder. Her hands, usually still at her sides, twitched, a phantom memory of gauze and makeshift clamps. The location. Could it be a superior mesenteric branch? The way the pressure is dropping so fast, and the lack of a clear source. Morales paused, scalpel hovering, and slowly turned his head. His eyes, usually cold, were now alight with fury, a blazing inferno of offended pride. Dr. Dubois snorted, a derisive sound. "Nurse Kim," Dubois began, his voice dripping with condescension, "I believe you're supposed to be watching the monitors, not offering unsolicited and frankly ludicrous diagnoses. Do you think Dr. Morales, the chief of surgery, needs a rookie nurse to tell him where to look?" Morales merely offered a slow, deliberate shake of his head, his gaze a glacial reprimand. Nurse Kim, if you wish to offer a prognosis, I suggest you apply to medical school again. Until then, you will perform your duties, and only your duties. His voice was low, cutting, a public humiliation delivered with surgical precision. The message was clear: stay in your lane, know your place. The word stung, a familiar burn that had accompanied her quiet tenure at Olympus Memorial. But this time, it was overlaid with something far more potent, a searing dread for Javier. Her mouth went dry, her throat tightening with unshed words, words that could save him. But the hierarchy, the unyielding wall of Morales' arrogance, had silenced her. Javier's monitor let out a long, flat wail. A terrifying, sustained beep. His oxygen saturation plummeted, the numbers flashing an angry red. The room plunged into a suffocating silence, broken only by the frantic gasps of the medical team. Morales spun back to the table, his earlier frustration morphing into something colder, more desperate. He was losing control, and Javier was losing his life. Sera's eyes darted from the flatlining monitor to Javier's still face, then back to Morales, whose precise, textbook efforts had failed. The war zone was calling, and its echoes were deafening. The sustained wail of Javier's monitor ripped through the controlled chaos of the operating room, a raw, primal scream of impending death. The digital display, once a beacon of vital signs, now blared a relentless, terrifying straight line. Flat line. Damn it! Morales' voice, usually a blade of precision, was now edged with a ragged tremor of panic. He lunged back towards the table, his earlier frustration replaced by a stark, desperate fear of losing. Compress. Get those blood units in faster. What are you waiting for? His orders, once crisp, now sounded like a man drowning, grasping for any available lifeline, even a phantom one. The room, moments before a hive of synchronized activity, fractured. Nurses moved with jerky, uncoordinated urgency. The anesthesiologist, his face ashen, wrestled with the ventilator, pumping air into lungs that were failing. Dr. Dubois, frozen for a beat, stammered, "Sir," his pressures dropping, "we're losing too much too fast." He looked to Morales, not for instruction, but for absolution, his own fear a pale echo of his superiors. Sera watched, every nerve ending screaming. The sterile white walls of Olympus Memorial dissolved, replaced by the dust and grit of a field hospital in a forgotten land. The scent of ozone and antiseptic vanished, overridden by the metallic tang of fresh blood and the acrid smoke of a distant fire. Javier's flatline was the sound of a mortar landing too close, the sudden, terrible silence that followed. She saw not Javier, but countless faces, young, old, civilian, soldier, all teetering on the brink, all demanding a solution that didn't exist in any textbook. Her mind raced, a torrent of images and improvisations from a brutal past. Not conventional access, too slow, too far, you need to staunch it now. The unique pattern of the bleed, the way the arterial tear pulsed, stubborn and relentless, was burned into her memory from a dozen similar, desperate encounters. It wasn't about meticulous repair yet, it was about stopping the gush, about buying seconds, precious, agonizing seconds. Morales, meanwhile, was making what Sera knew, with a sickening certainty, was a critical error. Under immense pressure, he fixated on the most obvious, yet in this specific case, ineffectual, approach. He was attempting to ligate a vessel in a conventional manner, deeper and deeper into the cavity, chasing the bleed, rather than establishing immediate, temporary control. His movements, usually so elegant, were becoming rushed, almost clumsy. His brow was furrowed, beads of sweat tracking paths through his hair, his mouth a thin, grim line. Each probing movement, however skilled, only seemed to agitate the already catastrophic situation, stirring the internal deluge. "We're losing him, doctor," the anesthesiologist cried, his voice strained. Heart rates unstable. Pupils fixed and dilated. Sera's breath caught. Pupils fixed and dilated. That was it. The absolute edge. "Move!" Morales barked, pushing a junior resident aside. He repositioned himself, a frantic energy radiating from him. "Another clamp. Get me the longest ones. We have to find the source." His voice was cracking now, his command slipping. He was brilliant, yes, but he was losing. And his arrogance, his inability to consider an alternative, was costing Javier his life. He was trapped in his own genius, unable to see beyond the established protocols he had mastered. "Sir, with all due respect," Sera started, her voice a low, urgent murmur, barely audible over the rising clamor. Her body moved instinctively a step forward, a micro-movement that was immediately perceived as a challenge. Given the location and the rate of bleed, a direct approach might only. "Nurse Kim." Dubois snapped, rounding on her, his own anxiety manifesting as an amplified echo of Morales's disdain. "Are you questioning the chief of surgery's methodology in an active code?" His voice was shrill, his face a mask of indignation, desperate to deflect from the unfolding disaster by finding a scapegoat. "Stay focused on your instruments." Morales didn't even turn. He merely waved a dismissive hand, a gesture that spoke volumes, inconsequential. Irrelevant. Silence. The dismissal was a physical blow, a fresh wound on top of old scars. Sera's mouth snapped shut. Her quiet rage simmered, a dangerous heat beneath her cool facade. But it was Javier's face, pale and lifeless on the table, that truly consumed her. His young life was slipping away, not from a lack of skill in the room, but from a failure of imagination, a rigid adherence to dogma in the face of unprecedented crisis. The system, designed to save, was now killing. A new alarm blared, a sharper, more insistent tone. The sound of a heart monitor flatlining again, but this time, it was more than just a signal. It was a dirge. The room went absolutely silent, the sound of the machine's mournful shriek cutting through the frantic whispers and clatter of instruments. Morales stopped, his hands suspended over Javier's open abdomen, covered in blood. His shoulders slumped, a single, devastating admission of defeat. The air in the OR grew heavy, thick with the smell of despair. Javier Ramos was gone. Or he would be, in moments. Sera's gaze locked onto Javier. The ghosts of the war zone roared in her ears, demanding action. Now or never. She could not stand by and watch another life extinguish itself when she held the knowledge to prevent it. The protocol, the hierarchy, the arrogance of men, none of it mattered against the absolute, undeniable command of a dying patient. A cold, fierce resolve settled over her, overriding fear, overriding caution, overriding everything but the deep, primal urge to save. Sera struggled to be heard, to have her unique knowledge recognized, echoes a feeling many of us know well, the frustration of being overlooked. If her quiet determination and hidden strength resonate with you, then we warmly invite you to become a part of our story. Hit that subscribe button and join our incredible global community. Your support isn't just a click, it actively helps us bring more compelling narratives, more hidden heroes, and better stories to life. Together, let's champion the underdogs and celebrate the power of true expertise. Thank you for being here, and welcome to our family. The air in the OR, already thick with the metallic tang of blood and the sterile scent of antiseptic, now hung heavy with an even more potent aroma, despair. Javier Ramos was gone. The thought echoed through the room like a death knell. Morales, his shoulders slumped, his genius momentarily eclipsed by a brutal reality, stood motionless, his surgical instruments useless in his gloved hands. The rest of the team mirrored his defeat, their faces pale, their movements stilled. It was over. But in Sera's mind, it was anything but. The flatline was a siren, not a eulogy. The ghosts that had roared moments ago now screamed, a chorus of forgotten faces, lost battles, and the bitter taste of helplessness. She saw the young man on the table, not as a casualty, but as a challenge, a life hanging by the thinnest thread. Her hands, usually so steady, now trembled with a mix of terror and an incandescent, desperate energy. Fear was a cold, sharp blade pressing against her throat. The fear of Morales's wrath, the fear of losing her license, of being branded a reckless fool, a dangerous outlier in a system built on rigid protocols. Olympus Memorial, with its gleaming surfaces and unbending hierarchy, would crush her without a second thought. She had come here to escape the chaos, to find a semblance of order and peace. To intervene now, to defy the chief of surgery, would be professional suicide. It would unravel everything she had carefully rebuilt. But then, another kind of fear took hold, far more ancient and primal, the fear of regret. The image of Javier Ramos, so young, so full of life just hours ago, burned behind her eyelids. She knew what to do. The impossible, unconventional, dirty fix was etched into her very being, a reflex honed in the crucible of war, where rules were luxuries and survival was the only law. Could she stand by, knowing she held the key, and watch him die? Could she ever look at herself in the mirror again? The internal war was swift, brutal, and silent. Courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was the decision to act despite it, to acknowledge the terror and still move forward. A different kind of energy surged through her veins, displacing the trembling. It wasn't adrenaline, but a cold, clear resolve, forged in the fires of 100 desperate moments. Her modesty, her quiet demeanor, her ingrained deference to authority, all of it crumbled away under the sheer weight of what needed to be done. Her gaze, which moments ago had been filled with anguish, sharpened, becoming an unflinching beam of concentration. The room, the hushed whispers, the defeated figures, they all faded into a blur. There was only Javier, the tear in his artery, and the solution burning in her mind. Her feet, seemingly of their own accord, began to move. It was a small step at first, then another, quiet and deliberate, yet utterly defiant. Every eye in the room, previously fixed on the flatlining monitor or Morales' slumped form, snapped to Sera. She moved with an almost dreamlike grace, not rushing, not panicking, but with a predator's calm focus. The quiet rookie nurse was gone, replaced by something fierce and elemental, a medic stripped bare of pretense, operating solely on instinct and raw, honed skill. Morales, startled by the shift in attention, looked up. His eyes, clouded with despair, narrowed as he saw Sera advancing towards the operating table. "Nurse Kim, what are you doing?" he barked, his voice hoarse, laced with a fresh wave of irritation. "Step away from the patient. We've done all we can." But Sera didn't stop. She didn't even acknowledge him verbally. Her focus was absolute, her trajectory unwavering. Her eyes, usually soft and apologetic, now blazed with an unshakable conviction. She reached the table, sidestepping Dr. Dubois, who recoiled as if she carried a live wire. Her hands, no longer trembling, went directly to the instrument tray, bypassing the standard surgical tools with an uncanny sense of purpose. She didn't grab a scalpel or a clamp. Instead, with a fluid movement, she reached for a heavy pair of trauma shears, a large forceps, and then, inexplicably, a length of strong, sterile medical tape, usually reserved for securing dressings. Her movements were economical, efficient, utterly devoid of wasted motion. Her face was a mask of serene intensity, her breathing deep and even, a stark contrast to the ragged gasps and defeated sighs of everyone else in the room. "Get back!" Morales roared, taking a threatening step forward. He was furious, bewildered, unable to comprehend the junior nurse's blatant insubordination. "This is not your place. You are jeopardizing everything." Sera's head barely turned. Her voice, when it came, was low, steady, and clear, cutting through the rising tension with the precision of a surgeon's blade. "He's not gone yet, doctor," she said, her gaze sweeping over Javier's pale, unmoving form. "And I know how to buy us time." Before anyone could react further, before Morales could issue another command or Dubois could scoff, Sera's hands were already moving over Javier's exposed abdomen. They were not the precise, delicate movements of an Olympus surgeon, they were the quick, decisive, almost brutal actions of someone fighting against the clock, against death itself, with whatever was at hand. The transformation was complete. The quiet nurse had vanished, and in her place stood a warrior. The quiet nurse had vanished, and in her place stood a warrior. Sera's hands, which moments before had held charts with such unassuming deference, now moved with a raw, almost predatory grace. She didn't pause, didn't hesitate. Her gaze, fiercely concentrated, scanned Javier's exposed abdomen, ignoring the chaos that had just consumed the room. She was no longer operating within the pristine, controlled environment of Olympus Memorial. She was back in the dust and blood of a forgotten field hospital, where protocols were luxuries and survival was the only rule. "Suction, now," she commanded, her voice an urgent whisper that somehow cut through the stunned silence. A junior nurse, trained to obey the hierarchy but now caught in the bewildering shift of authority, instinctively moved the suction tool closer. Sera didn't wait for Morales' permission, nor did she ask for a delicate tissue forceps. Her eyes darted to the instrument tray, bypassing the array of gleaming, specialized tools. Her hand shot out, not for a precise surgical clamp, but for a sturdy, heavier hemostat typically reserved for larger vessels or securing drapes. It was an instrument designed for brute force, not surgical finesse. The attending surgeon, Dr. Eleanor Vance, gasped audibly. "What are you doing?" Dr. Dubois stammered, his face pale, his earlier arrogance replaced by an expression of terrified bewilderment. He looked to Morales for guidance, but the chief of surgery was frozen, his mouth slightly agape, a strange mixture of rage and utter stupefaction warring in his eyes. Sera ignored them all. With a decisive, almost violent snap, she clamped the hemostat deep within the cavity, not exactly where Morales had been searching, but slightly off, at an angle that seemed reckless, yet perfectly calculated. A gush of blood, dark and viscous, momentarily welled up, then, impossibly, slowed. Not stopped entirely, but significantly stemmed. A collective intake of breath swept through the OR. Monitors, which had been flatlining, showed a faint, erratic flicker, a ghost of electrical activity, a desperate pulse trying to reassert itself. Sera needed more. Strongest ligature. Now. Her voice was still low, urgent, utterly devoid of panic. Another junior nurse, trembling but mesmerized, fumbled with a spool of heavy-duty suture material, thicker, stronger, meant for closing deep facial layers, not delicate internal arteries. Sera snatched it. Her fingers, nimble and precise despite the unconventional material, worked with a blinding speed that defied her unassuming appearance. She didn't tie the intricate, multi-layered knots of conventional surgery. Her knot was simpler, brutally effective, a single, taut constriction that bypassed standard procedure entirely. It was a knot designed for one thing: to hold, to grip, to buy time. Morales watched, his fury slowly draining away, replaced by a cold dread and a burgeoning, disorienting awe. He had spent his entire career mastering the elegant dance of textbook surgery, the precise angles, the sterile protocols, the meticulous pursuit of perfection. What Sera was doing was none of that. It was raw, almost crude, an act of sheer, desperate improvisation that violated every tenet he held sacred. Yet, it was working. The blood flow, though not completely arrested, was now drastically reduced. Javier's heart, still weak, started to beat with a more discernible rhythm on the monitor. The frantic, high-pitched alarms that had signaled his demise had quieted, replaced by the faint, reassuring thump-thump of a struggling but present heartbeat. Sera leaned back slightly, her breath coming in short, controlled bursts. A bead of sweat traced a path down her temple. Her eyes, still intensely focused, met Morales's for a fleeting second. In their depths, he saw not defiance, but a profound weariness, an echo of countless battles fought against overwhelming odds. She had done what he, the chief of surgery, could not. She had pulled Javier back from the brink of oblivion, not with finesse, but with the brutal, undeniable efficacy of survival. The OR was utterly silent, save for the hum of machines and the sound of Javier's tenacious heart. The air throbbed with a mixture of disbelief, horror, and a dawning, terrifying understanding. This quiet, unassuming nurse had just performed a miracle of desperation. With a final, almost tenderly brutal motion, Sera tightened the makeshift tourniquet, securing the improvised clamp sheet fashioned to the vital artery. Her hands, still smeared with blood, withdrew with a swift, economical grace, leaving her raw, visceral fix in place. She didn't look at it, didn't admire it. Her gaze remained locked on the monitor, where Javier's heartbeat, though still weak, now pulsed with a fragile, consistent rhythm. She gave a sharp nod, a silent command more powerful than any shouted order, stepping back barely an inch to indicate that her part, the part nobody else could play, was done. Morales, though still visibly shaken, responded with an almost animalistic professional instinct. The slight tremor in his hands was still there, but his eyes, though clouded with a profound bewilderment, snapped back into surgical focus. "Forceps! Suction," he barked, his voice regaining some of its usual authority, albeit laced with an unprecedented note of urgency, almost desperation. The scrub nurse, jolted from her own stunned silence, moved like a phantom, anticipating his needs. As Morales, with a renewed, almost furious precision, began the delicate work of repairing the damage Sera had arrested, the oar slowly, imperceptibly, began to breathe again. The air, thick moments ago with the suffocating dread of impending death, thinned out, allowing cautious hope to seep in. Javier's vitals, displayed starkly on the monitor, continued their agonizingly slow ascent. The blood pressure, which had plummeted to near zero, climbed back into a viable range. The oxygen saturation, once a terrifying dip of red, began to glow green. Dr. Dubois, who had been frozen in place, a silent monument to his own inadequacy and the chief's defeat, slowly sagged against the wall. His initial expression of shocked contempt had morphed into wide-eyed disbelief, and now, a dawning, grudging respect flickered in his eyes as he watched Morales work with a precision made possible only by Sera's intervention. The anesthesiologist, whose face had been a mask of grim defeat, let out a long, shuddering breath, his hand shaking as he adjusted a dial, his gaze drifting from the monitor to Sera, then back to the operating field. Sera, leaning against the sterile cart, felt an incredible wave of exhaustion crash over her. The adrenaline, which had been a roaring inferno in her veins, receded, leaving her trembling slightly, her muscles aching, her mind utterly spent. She wiped a stray drop of blood from her cheek with the back of her wrist. The silence of the oar was no longer the silence of impending doom, but a taut, focused quiet, punctuated by the rhythmic snip-snip of instruments, the soft whir of the suction, and the glorious, consistent thump-thump of Javier's tenacious heart. It was the sound of life clinging on, strong enough now for the master surgeon to mend it. Minutes stretched into an eternity, yet simultaneously flew by. Morales, now fully immersed in his craft, meticulously stitched and sealed, his movements regaining their famed fluidity. He was repairing the intricate vascular network, a task only truly possible now that the catastrophic torrent had been stemmed. He didn't look at Sera again, but the way he moved, the renewed purpose in his every action, was a silent testament to the impossible gift she had given him, time. Finally, with a soft click, Morales set down his last instrument. He stepped back, the full weight of his accomplishment and, more acutely, the extraordinary circumstances that led to it, settling on him. The oar was silent once more, but this time, it was a profound, reverent silence. Javier's heart continued to beat, steady and strong. The monitors displayed a picture of fragile stability. He was out of immediate danger. He was saved. A collective sigh, barely audible but profoundly felt, rippled through the room. Shoulders slumped, not in defeat, but in release. A scrub nurse, her eyes shining with unshed tears, quickly dabbed at her face. The anesthesiologist gave a small, almost imperceptible nod to Sera, a silent acknowledgement of her impossible feat. Sera closed her eyes for a moment, letting the wave of catharsis wash over her. The ghosts of the war zone, the faces of those she couldn't save, faded slightly, replaced by the persistent, reassuring thump-thump of Javier's heart. She had defied protocol, defied a chief, defied her quiet nature. And she had won. Not with textbook precision, but with the brutal, beautiful art of survival. The relief that flooded her was so profound it bordered on pain. Javier was alive. And in that moment, nothing else mattered. The oar, which had moments ago been a vortex of despair, now buzzed with a low hum of activity, a symphony of relief. As the last sutures were tied and Javier was prepared for transfer to intensive care, Dr. Morales stood motionless, his scrub-gloved hand still poised as if in prayer. His face, usually a mask of control, was a canvas of shock, confusion, and something akin to awe. Dr. Dubois, eyes wide, looked from Sera to Morales and back again, his sycophantic grin utterly absent. The sheer audacity of what had just transpired seemed to have short-circuited his capacity for smugness. Sera, once Javier's pulse stabilized, had moved with practiced efficiency to assist the scrub nurse in gathering instruments, her movements economical, her expression calm. She didn't meet anyone's gaze, her quiet demeanor a stark contrast to the earthquake she had just caused. She merely existed, a ghost slipping through the aftershocks of her own making. The adrenaline, which had coursed through her like wildfire, now left her feeling hollowed out, but fundamentally, profoundly, peaceful. Javier was alive. Later that night, the hospital corridors were quieter, the frantic energy of the day settling into a low thrum. Sera was in the nurse's station, meticulously charting Javier's vitals, her handwriting neat and precise. The soft click of approaching footsteps broke her concentration. She looked up to see Dr. Morales standing before her, his posture less rigid than usual, his brow furrowed in a way she hadn't seen before. He wasn't wearing his surgical scrubs, but a tailored suit, a silent signal that this was not a professional debriefing, but something more personal. "Nurse Kim," he began, his voice raspy, devoid of its usual booming authority. He cleared his throat. "We need to talk." Sera nodded, closing the chart. She led him to an empty consult room, the fluorescent lights humming impersonally. The air was thick with unspoken questions. Morales sat opposite her, leaning forward, his gaze intense. "What you did in there, Sera, it was impossible. Reckless. Irresponsible. And it saved his life." The words tumbled out, a conflicted torrent of anger and grudging respect. "I don't understand how. I don't understand why you thought you could do that." Sera met his gaze, her dark eyes clear and unwavering. There was no defensiveness, no pride, only a weary honesty. "It was the only way, Dr. Morales. The tear was unique, high up, and too rapid. Standard access would have killed him." She paused, then added, "I've seen it before. Not here, not in a place like Olympus." Morales scoffed, a habit, but it lacked its usual sting. "Seen what? A miraculous dirty fix performed by a nurse?" His eyes narrowed. "Just who are you, Nurse Kim?" Sera sighed, a long, slow release of breath that seemed to carry the weight of years. "My name is Sera, Dr. Morales. Before I was a nurse, I was a trauma medic. For a very long time. In places where the only protocol was to keep people breathing, with whatever you had, whatever you could find. No textbooks, no gleaming equipment, just instinct and desperation." She didn't elaborate, but the words hung in the air, painting a stark, brutal picture. War zones. The unspoken understood. The casual way she uttered whatever you had spoke volumes of makeshift tourniquets, field surgeries, and the raw, unpolished art of survival. It wasn't about qualifications printed on a certificate, it was about the scars etched on her soul, the lives held in her calloused hands. She wasn't just qualified, she was forged. Morales stared, absorbing this. His mind, accustomed to the pristine order of modern medicine, grappled with the raw, visceral reality of her past. He saw her now not as a quiet rookie, but as a silent warrior, a ghost from a different kind of battlefield. The arrogance that usually insulated him began to crumble, replaced by a profound humility. His dismissal of her, his mockery, it wasn't just rude, it had been ignorant, myopic. You didn't just think you could do it," he murmured, the realization dawning. "You knew. You'd done it before." "I knew Javier wouldn't survive another minute otherwise," Sera confirmed simply. "And I couldn't let him die. Not when there was a way." Her voice softened, revealing a sliver of the deep empathy that fueled her actions. "No matter how unconventional." Morales rose, walking to the window, his back to her. The city lights twinkled, indifferent to the personal revolution happening within him. He saw the world, and his place in it, a little differently now. "Sera," he said, turning back, his voice low but steady, "what I said to you, what I implied, it was unforgivable. I let my ego, my preconceptions, blind me to what was right in front of me. To who was right in front of me." He met her gaze, his own filled with a dawning respect. "You saved Javier Ramos. And you taught me a lesson I won't soon forget. Thank you." It wasn't just an apology for his words, it was an acknowledgement of her entire being, of the brutal crucible that had forged her extraordinary skill. For Sera, it was more than just a validation of her actions, it was a profound recognition of her journey, her sacrifices, her silent battles. The weight on her shoulders, the ever-present ghosts, felt a little lighter. She merely dipped her head, a small, humble gesture. "I just did my job, Dr. Morales." But the quiet strength in her eyes told a different story, the story of a woman who had finally found a place where her unique, hard-won expertise could be seen, understood, and truly valued. Dr. Santiago Morales, a man who once navigated the sterile halls of Olympus Memorial with the unquestioned authority of a titan, now walked with a subtle shift in his bearing. The arrogance hadn't vanished entirely, old habits die hard, but it was deeply scarred, replaced by a raw, new humility. His apology to Sera wasn't a private gesture confined to a quiet corridor, it echoed through the team, then permeated the entire surgical department. In the days and weeks that followed, Morales' transformation became visible in his actions. He held an unscheduled grand rounds, not to present a new technique, but to discuss the critical lessons learned from Javier Ramos's case. He spoke, not of his own brilliance, but of the invaluable, unconventional insight that had saved a young life. He publicly acknowledged Sera Kim's extraordinary field experience, validating her not as just a nurse, but as a seasoned medic whose skills transcended textbook limitations. He even initiated a new hospital-wide initiative to broaden the scope of clinical input, subtly encouraging junior staff and even ancillary personnel to speak up with observations or suggestions, regardless of their role or perceived status. His once dismissive gaze now held a flicker of curiosity, a willingness to genuinely listen. For Dr. Renard Dubois, the change was more uncomfortable. Stripped of his primary mirror and sounding board for arrogance, Dubois found himself adrift. He tried, at first, to mimic Morales' newfound openness, but his attempts felt forced, lacking the genuine respect now emanating from his mentor. He saw the quiet, knowing glances exchanged by nurses and residents when he tried to pontificate. He felt the subtle shift in the air when Sera was in a room, not deference, but a deep, earned respect that he, with all his status, simply didn't command. Dubois, faced with the stark reality of his own hollow posturing, began a grudging, painful journey of self-reflection. He started to watch Sera more closely, not with scorn, but with a bewildered, almost envious fascination, trying to decode the source of her quiet power. The sycophant was forced to learn authenticity, or risk becoming truly irrelevant. Meanwhile, Javier Ramos recovered. Slowly, steadily, the young man whose life had hung by a thread began to heal. Sera visited him in recovery, not for glory, but out of genuine care. She saw the relief in his parents' eyes, the hope returning to Javier's own. One afternoon, Javier, still weak but clear-headed, asked her, they said it was a miracle. That you did something nobody else could. Sera just smiled gently. We all did our part, Javier. You did the hardest part, fighting to stay with us. His gratitude, however, was unmistakable, a silent testament to the life she had saved. Sera, though still modest in demeanor, found her place had profoundly shifted. She remained the quiet nurse, diligent and unassuming, but her presence in the OR now carried an unspoken weight. Colleagues sought her out, not just for practical advice, but for her calm counsel in high-stress situations. The unorthodox habits that once drew Morales' scorn were now seen for what they were, efficient, intuitive solutions born of hard-won wisdom. She no longer had to hide her true self or compartmentalize her past. The ghosts of the war zones didn't vanish, but they no longer haunted her. Instead, they anchored her, providing a profound, steady confidence. She carried her trauma, yes, but now it was a source of strength, acknowledged and understood, rather than a hidden burden. Olympus Memorial, once a fortress of rigid protocol and hierarchical pride, began to subtly transform. The value of diverse experiences, of looking beyond the textbook, became part of the internal dialogue. It wasn't an overnight revolution, but a slow, hopeful evolution. Morales, having learned his most profound lesson from the most unexpected teacher, became an unlikely advocate for this new openness, ensuring that the hospital wasn't just elite, but genuinely human. Sera Kim, the quiet rookie, had not sought recognition, yet she had earned the deepest kind, the respect of her peers, the gratitude of a life saved, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing her unique, hard-won expertise had finally found its true, invaluable purpose. She had not become louder or flashier, but she had become undeniably herself, a beacon of authentic, resilient strength in the heart of a gleaming, transforming institution. The hope she ignited wasn't a sudden flare, but a steady, persistent glow, reminding everyone that sometimes the greatest wisdom resides in the most humble of packages, waiting for the moment to heal not just bodies, but hearts and cultures too. Sera's journey reminds us that true wisdom often blossoms in the quietest corners, and that embracing diverse experiences can transform everything. It's a powerful testament to the quiet strength within us all. What unexpected lessons have you learned from a quiet hero in your own life? Share your stories below. If Sera's resilience resonated with you and you believe in the power of authentic narratives, please subscribe. Join our growing global community, and together, help us create more inspiring, meaningful stories like this. Your support is invaluable. Thank you for watching and for being such a cherished part of our journey.